Okay, we're back. So I want to go ahead and pick right back up where we ended up last time. Again, we're talking about how the information that we talked about in the previous chapters fits into this part of developing the hypothesis test.
This is what we talked about. A lot of this came out of chapter 5, okay, where we talked about, chapter 4. Chapter 4, we talked about the probability and those kind of things. The type of data that we're going to be collecting. We talked about that in chapter 1, whether it's going to be nominal or ordinal. The type of the sample, we also talked about that in chapter 1. The size of the sample, we picked that up in chapter 7. The assumptions about the normality, the describing of the data, and we picked up the normality assumption in chapter 5. Describing the data, that was something that we spent quite a bit of time in. It's actually a fairly easy concept to do, drawing the graphs and those kind of things. We actually decided that we would, we covered that in chapter 2. In the same part of this, we're going to identify the outliers. And we talked about that in chapter 3. And we talked about the type of sample and the importance of random samples and those kind of things. We covered that in chapter 6. So you can see that, we've got chapter 1, chapter 2. Let me get this out a little bit wider so you can see what we're doing in this part of it, in putting together the elements of the hypothesis test. We're putting together the information from chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7. And all of these are coming together at this point. And hopefully, it may have been a little bit disjointed up to this point, but all of these concepts that we've studied are coming together. And so we go through, and in the hypothesis test, we collect the data, and then we go through and we run the test. Whether we're going to go through and do a t-test or a chi-square test, we're going to talk about those in the next chapters, whichever test. There's a lot of different statistical tests that we could do. So that we go through and we use computer programs. Some of them we can do it with a calculator fairly easily. But we run the test, and then after we run the test, then we're going to get a test statistic. And we spent a lot of time in the course talking about the calculation of the z-scores. Okay? Most of the test statistics are going to have some form that's similar to that for the z-scores. And from that, that test statistic will then be compared to a critical value. And, computer programs will give that, but up to this point what we've been using is just using the tables in the back of the book to look up those. And there's tables for the t-test, there's tables for the f-test, for the chi-square. We will actually use those. So the z-scores will help us with calculating the critical value from the table, and will also help us to see how the test statistic is connected with the critical value. Then, after we've done all of that, then we compare the test statistic to the critical value, and then we're going to draw some sort of conclusion. And that's what would actually go in, and we're writing this up maybe for our research or whatever we're going to be doing. if you go and you read a research article, you'll see where they've gone through these different steps and they've identified these steps that are used in that study. Again, I can't emphasize it enough. We spend a lot of time up to this point going through these. The first half of the semester up to like the midterm, we've been covering all of these different concepts. And now, after the midterm, we've got enough of this stuff under our belt so that we can go through and we can start going through and understanding exactly what we're going to do. Now, in some of the assignments or some of the questions,
I mean, break in at this point, I think that I go through and start giving some of the problems and stuff like that, work out some of the problems. I'm not really sure exactly what I did, but I do want to point out something that's important at this point. Basically, we're going through and talking about research, and I don't know, where you're going to end up, in your career or anything like that. If you're in an area that writing a research paper is going to be important, or reading someone else's research, then this is a critical thing to understand. This is the way that experimentation and research often works. We start off, and as a researcher, you make a claim. You state the null hypothesis, and again, the alternative hypothesis is going to be the one that you want to prove. The research hypothesis, the alternative hypothesis. So you make that claim. In that process, you specify what significance level you're going to accept, whether it's 0.05. That's the most common one you're going to find out. And then you go and you do your study. You obtain your sample, and you collect your data. Then you use the appropriate statistical technique to analyze that. If you don't use the appropriate statistical technique, you may not find the results that the data has shown, or the data wants to show you that it's there. If you do a t-test instead of doing an analysis of variance, or if, there's a lot of problems that can go wrong there. And then after you've analyzed it, then we obtain a p-value, critical value, compare that to our significance level that we specified up here, and we decide whether we're going to reject the null hypothesis or do not reject the null hypothesis. And that's the conclusion. We write that up and we say that's what we found in our study. Then the important thing is that gets published or shared with somebody else, and then they go through and they take this information and they build another study. It goes through the cycle again. And it just continues to go through this cycle until, and we find out more and more information about how things work out. So I'll come back in just a minute and look at the